Welcome to this special edition of EDDIE-FICATION in honor of our 182nd anniversary of Emancipation. Trinidad and Tobago put on a lavish celebration, while Jamaica recognizes the many struggles which led them to emancipation. We in the smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles are happy to have a long weekend that lots of our youthful population have absolutely no idea about, and for the most part use it for fete and other rum drinking activities. But today we're going to set that straight with some historical perspective on emancipation. So again, I urge our young people to pull up your chair and pay attention.
This weekend is Emancipation Weekend, with the 1st of August being acknowledged as Emancipation Day. The following is an overview of our history as it relates to emancipation and its attendant struggles, taken from This Is My Island, a historical account of Grenada's past by yours truly. Up to 1783, virtually everyone in Britain, the government, the church, the commercial interests, and most of the public had enthusiastically supported the slave trade. The declining profitability of West Indian slavery now set in motion a reconsideration of the slavery issue from a political and moral point of view. As the 18th century drew to a close, so too did the West Indian slave trade. More and more people began to realize how evil a business slavery was. The Society of Friends in England, also called the Quakers, were among the first to condemn slavery. A movement in England, gallantly led by William Wilberforce, spoke out too on the evils of slavery. In 1807, the British Parliament took the first important step towards the freedom of Negroes by abolishing the slave trade. This did not mean that it did not continue illegally in many instances. Grenada's slave population was at that time comparatively large, and this appeared to have caused no immediate anxiety to the colonists. However, the planters realized that before long, the abolition of slavery was bound to affect their interests. After the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, there was an influx of various missionary groups into Grenada. The missionaries who worked in Grenada and the other West Indian islands belonged to different denominations of Protestant Christianity. By the end of the 18th century, all the churches inspired by religious revivals started missionary organizations in connection with improved conditions for the slaves. The reformist policy was a failure. The West Indian slaves had seen the potential of direct and violent action in the Haitian Revolution, and they were no longer willing to wait for emancipation from on high. Many slaves, in fact, believed that the British government had already decreed emancipation, but that freedom was being withheld by the plantation owners. The West Indian islands began to explode one by one. In 1808, there was a slave insurrection in British Guiana, BG, and in 1816, slaves in Barbados revolted, claiming that the island belonged to them. This had a major impact on Grenada, which had been simmering quietly since Fedor's rebellion, which influenced the threat of outbreaks in 1802 and 1806. From October 1819, when the Slave Registry Act was passed by the Imperial Parliament, the Home Government gave much attention to the inclusion of grants of money for the temporal and spiritual welfare of slaves in Grenada. It was during this period that the churches and schools were established and clergymen were vigorously pursued to meet the needs of local government. In 1823, there were 2 Anglican and 2 Roman Catholic churches, 3 Wesleyan chapels and 11 schools, 6 of which were in St. George's, where a central school was established in the following year. The growth of churches continued, and 1830 may be termed a church building year in Grenada. For in that year, the commencement of building no less than 4 churches begun in St. Patrick, St. Andrew, St. David, and St. George. In 1832, the non-white inhabitants numbered 26,704, of whom 1,500 were free coloreds, 1,600 free blacks, and 23,604 slaves. On August 28, 1833, the Imperial Parliament passed the Act declaring the slaves in the British Dominion to be free. With a view, however, to gradually preparing them for their new social conditions, £20 million were granted by the British government. The news was cheerfully received in the colony, and an act was passed to bring the decision or bill into effect by 1st August 1834. At midnight on 31st July 1834, nearly 750,000 men, women and children in the British West Indies ceased to be slaves. By the Act of Emancipation passed by the British government, there was an agreed period of transition to full freedom. The period was known as apprenticeship. All apprentices were only able to earn wages or choose their own occupations after they had given about 40 hours of unpaid labor each week. Unlike some of the other British West Indian islands, emancipation was marked by orderly behavior in Grenada. This Father Raymond de Vast thought must have been caused by the influence of a Roman Catholic priest who kept close to the slaves during the period leading up to freedom. Unlike some of the other British West Indian islands, emancipation was marked by orderly behavior in Grenada. William Wilberforce will long be remembered for his tremendous work in securing the emancipation of slaves. In appreciation of his services, the Lower Cemetery in St. George's, Grenada, bears his name. On the 22nd of May 1838, complete emancipation of the slaves was celebrated in Grenada and, of course, the West Indies. There were church services, and thousands of freed slaves dressed in their Sunday best hastened to their churches and chapels, which had been decked with flowers, green boughs, and palms. The effects of emancipation were felt in many quarters in various ways. Not all of the freed house slaves or domestics were pleased. However, the general feeling of joy and freedom of the freed slaves in the island overshadowed the ill feeling of the minority. The Emancipation Act of 1833 officially ended slavery in the British colonies, but it did not immediately end the plantation system nor the planters' domination of black labor. Even before emancipation, the British government was formulating a strategy for keeping the blacks on the plantation. They said the greatest problem to be solved in drawing up any plan for the emancipation of the slaves in our colonies is to devise some mode of inducing them, when relieved from the fare of the driver and his whip, to undergo the regular and continuous labor which is indispensable in carrying out the production of sugar. I think that it would be greatly for the real happiness of the Negroes themselves if the facility of acquiring land could be so far restrained as to prevent them, on the abolition of slavery, from abandoning their habits of regular industry. In fact, the slaves were not actually freed in 1833. Slavery was replaced by a system of apprenticeship which required that ex-slaves give 40 hours of unpaid labor per week to their former masters. This apprenticeship period was supposed to last 4 years for domestic slaves and 6 years for field slaves, but it was cut short by the British House of Commons in 1838, and all the slaves were freed at the same time. History reveals that this apprenticeship period was the worst in the history of slavery in the British West Indies. Planters saw this period as a period suitable to squeeze the last juice of compulsory labor before the great ruin of freedom set in. As stated by George Brizan, historian, economist, effective West Indian history lecturer and author, what seemed to the slaves as some piece of bacon or ham appeared to the planters as some poison. Repression of the ex-slaves began almost immediately as the Grenada legislature passed laws to curtail the movement of former slaves. The first such law was passed on August 2nd, 1834, one day after emancipation. It imposed harsh penalties for all types of theft. Another passed in May 1836 was entitled An Act to Provide for the Mere Effectual Suppression of Vagrancy and for the Punishment of Idle and Disorderly Persons. A vagrant was defined as an unemployed person or an unlicensed hawker or peddler. This act was followed quickly by the creation of a local police force to execute the new laws. It is significant to note that unemployment, prostitution, hustling, and theft were assumed to be the only alternatives to slavery for the blacks. It would appear that the mentality of many planters did not allow them to imagine Africans as independent or self-sufficient, and it probably never occurred to them that the freed slaves would want to go into farming for themselves. Indeed, they did. The planters tried everything to keep the ex-slaves attracted to the sugar estates, often refusing to sell or rent them land. Small plots of fertile land were easily available in Grenada's mountainous interior. However, and defying the efforts of the planters, many of the ex-slaves abandoned the plantations and headed for the hills. Others emigrated to Trinidad. The freed slaves' desire for economic independence was so strong that a new class was created overnight, that of the small farmer. The ex-slaves were intent on moving away from their physical place of enslavement to cultivate their own lots anyway. The exodus of the former slaves from the plantations produced a large population of independent farmers who grew food crops and cocoa on small plots of land in the bush. Much of this was simply idle land or abandoned land, which was cultivated by squatters who were free to work them just as much or as little as they pleased, acknowledging no master. Lands also became available as unprofitable sugarcane estates were divided up and sold or rented in small lots. The small farmers were able to sell some of their surplus crops to Barbados and Trinidad, beginning the trafficker tradition which still exists today. Two types of labor became available to the planters. One was the ex-slaves, many of whom became sharecroppers or wage laborers on the estates of combined independent farming with paid estate labor in some way. The other was imported labor, a revival of the 17th century indentured servitude schemes, with Africans and East Indians in place of the poor whites or bottom-foot buckras. In 1846 to 1847, an experiment with 438 Portuguese from Madeira failed. By 1849, just over 1,000 freed slaves were imported on contract and proved successful. After their contracts were ended, the majority of them became landowners and squatters like their predecessors. From 1857, indentured servants came from India. Within 5 years, 2,022 East Indians were imported to rehabilitate several abandoned estates. Folks, the foregoing was an overview of how we got to this point of celebrating Emancipation Day.
In closing, folks, I am consciously with Brian Grimes, ex-Public Relations Officer of the Public Workers Union, the PWU, and a stalwart of the trade union movement who shall rise again because he's appetizing to our nation's youth. He recently said, "I refuse to celebrate Emancipation Day when our leaders who are elected via a colonial political system are enabling the subtle recolonization of Grenada." Young people, pull up your chair and pay attention to your unlimited possibilities.